Hidden away in the Montana Territory archives is a leather-bound journal that has kept one of America's darkest family stories sealed for over a century. Found in 1943 by forest rangers clearing an old trapping route, the journal runs 847 pages long and was written in 3 different styles of handwriting, all belonging to members of the same family. What those pages describe about the winter of 1867 in the Bitterroot Mountains is a chilling account that blurs the line between survival sanity and the collapse of human nature. The authorities who first reviewed the journal locked it away, immediately deciding it was too disturbing for the public, and for decades, the story of the Wainwright family remained hidden in classified government files. Before we move into the account of Barnabas Wainwright and his daughters, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit the bell, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Because stories like this could have unfolded in any remote corner of the country during those brutal frontier winters. The discovery of the Wainwright Journal reshaped how investigators thought about missing persons cases from the 1860s. Because what unfolded inside that cabin wasn't just tragedy. It was a step-by-step record of how isolation, despair, and grief can twist a man beyond recognition. Barnabas Wainwright had built his life as one of the most successful fur traders operating between Fort Benton and the Canadian border. At 42, he was respected as someone who could survive where others died, a man who read the wilderness like a book and thrived in places that punished the unprepared. His trading post sat on Beaver Creek, a vital stop for trappers, prospectors, and military patrols. Barnabas had married Catherine Bellwether, daughter of a Methodist minister from St. Louis in 1851, and she followed him west with a strength that defined frontier women. She learned to cure meat, treat wounds, and run a household, even when their nearest neighbor lived 30 miles away. Together they raised 3 daughters, Margaret 26, Elizabeth 24, and Sarah 21, each inheriting both their mother's intelligence and their father's resilience. Catherine insisted on daily lessons no matter the season, and Margaret developed a gift for record-keeping, logging trade transactions, weather, and supplies with precision. Elizabeth became known for her skill in sewing and healing, often tending to wounded or frostbitten trappers. Sarah had a knack for predicting weather shifts and animal pattern skills that often kept the family safe. The Wainwright home was more than a cabin. It was a fortified settlement with outbuildings, a smokehouse, a storage shed, and guest quarters, all designed to withstand the brutal Montana winters that could trap families for months. By 1867, the Wainwrights had gathered wealth and influence. Barnabas held trapping rights trade networks with native tribes and investments in mining claims. His name carried weight from Fort Benton to Helena, and even military officials sought his counsel about the northern frontier. Catherine's letters home painted a picture of prosperity. That summer, Margaret was engaged to a merchant in Helena. Elizabeth was gaining a reputation as a healer among native communities, and Sarah's wildlife sketches had caught the attention of visitors who commissioned her art. Despite their isolation, the family found comfort in each other. Winter evenings were spent by the stone fireplace, with Catherine reading from books ordered from the East, the daughters working on crafts and writing, and Barnabas planning the coming season's trade expeditions. For more than 15 years, the Wainwrights had thrived where others faltered, relying on discipline, faith, and resourcefulness. Yet the journal they left behind tells a very different story of that winter. That winter, a story that would destroy their reputation and cast a shadow over one of the most respected families in Montana Territory. The Wainwrights had long been seen by their few scattered neighbors as the ideal of frontier life, proof that refinement and stability could endure even in the harshest corners of the Montana Territory. But on October 15, 1867, everything began to unravel when a storm of historic proportions descended from the Canadian peaks. The first blizzard struck without the usual signs that seasoned mountain settlers depended on. Catherine Wainwright, returning from the creek where she had been washing bedding before the freeze was caught by the storm's fierce winds and thrown from the narrow log bridge. Her screams rose above the roar of the storm, and her daughters rushed into the blinding snow to find her trapped beneath collapsed timbers, her legs pinned in the freezing torrent. By the time they freed her, she had endured nearly an hour in the icy water. Barnabas carried his unconscious wife back to the cabin, stripping away her frozen clothing while the family tried desperately to revive her with every remedy they knew. For 3 days, Catherine lingered between life and death. Her body racked with fever, her voice fading in and out of delirium as she called out for people from her childhood. The family's supplies were limited. The nearest doctor lived more than 80 miles away, and by October 18th, Catherine was gone. Her death tore away the anchor that had steadied the Wainwright family for 16 years. Barnabas sat beside her body nearly half a day, refusing to allow his daughters to prepare her for storage. The frozen ground made burial impossible, so they followed the grim custom of the frontier and carried her body wrapped in quilts to the smokehouse, where she would remain until spring. Margaret's journal describes the chilling weight of that moment. But Sarah's entries reveal something even more unsettling. Almost immediately, Barnabas began to slip. He abandoned his room, spending nights in the main cabin, staring at Catherine's empty chair. He stopped grooming himself, his beard growing wild, his clothes unkempt. On October 25th, Margaret recorded the first sign of madness, her father speaking to Catherine's chair as though she were still alive, debating trade deals and household matters with an unseen partner. At first, the daughters told themselves it was grief, a temporary refusal to accept the truth. But as the days passed, his behavior grew darker. He began setting a place for Catherine at every meal, placing food before her untouched plate. When Margaret suggested they stop, Barnabas erupted, raging at her for dishonoring her mother. With no neighbors reachable through the deepening snow and no patrols traveling the frozen mountain passes, the Wainwrights were completely cut off. Elizabeth's journal captures their growing dread, writing that their father seemed to vanish into a world where mother still lives while we become strangers to him. She found him arguing with Catherine's empty chair, his voice rising and falling as if he were responding to words only he could hear. By Thanksgiving, the family's isolation had become absolute. Snow had climbed to the bottom of the windows, sealing the cabin in a silent white prison, broken only by the howl of wolves circling closer each night. Margaret wrote that their orderly life quickly unraveled without their mother's guiding presence. Meals were no longer regular. Sometimes Barnabas would forget to eat for days, then suddenly demand grand feasts in Catherine's honor. The daughters lived in fear, watching for any spark that might ignite their father's anger. Most disturbing of all was the way Barnabas began treating Catherine's possessions, as though by holding on to them, he could hold on to her, even as his mind slipped further into a place where the line between memory and reality no longer existed. Barnabas's decline deepened into something the daughters could neither understand nor escape. He had stripped Catherine's bedroom bare, moving her clothing, jewelry, and keepsakes into the main living room, arranging them around her empty chair as if she might return to reclaim them. Most disturbing of all, he cut her hair before placing her body in the smokehouse and spent hours each day brushing those locks, whispering conversations meant for his late wife, as though she could still hear him. Sarah's journal paints the clearest picture of how far he was slipping. She wrote of waking in the night to find her father sitting naked before the fire, speaking tenderly into the air about his courtship, their wedding night, and moments no child should ever hear. When she tried to cover him with a blanket, he lashed out violently, screaming that she was interrupting a private conversation with her mother. By December, Barnabas no longer seemed to recognize his daughters as family. Instead, he accused them of stealing Catherine's affection, insisting that their mother worried more about them than she did about him. His eyes grew wild during these tirades, his voice breaking between pitiful pleading and feral rage, leaving the young women terrified of what he might do next. Elizabeth's journals describe the unbearable tension of never knowing which man would emerge, the broken husband weeping over his wife, or the hostile stranger who blamed them for her death and resented their very presence. Food supplies carefully calculated before winter dwindled far too quickly. Barnabas swung between refusing meals altogether and demanding feasts in Catherine's honor. Worse still, the daughters discovered he had been discarding perfectly good meat. Claiming Catherine warned him it was spoiled and then accused his daughters of plotting to poison him and their mother. He began hiding food throughout the cabin, stashing it in places only he knew. As if their father's unraveling wasn't enough, the wilderness itself seemed to press in closer each night. Sarah documented the wolves gathering around the cabin, sketching the outlines of a pack that had grown to more than 30, larger than anything she had ever seen. Their howls rose in eerie coordination, a chorus that seemed to mock the family's despair, echoing through the snowbound forest and rattling the fragile walls of the cabin. Margaret's entry from December 15th records the moment the sisters realized they were no longer just dealing with grief, but with something far darker. She wrote that their father spoke to Catherine's chair for 3 hours, then turned his gaze on them, with eyes that no longer recognized them as daughters. It was the look of a man who saw something else entirely, she wrote. That day he asked Elizabeth to brush her hair as Catherine once had, watching with unsettling intensity. Then he asked Sarah to put on Catherine's blue dress, the one she had worn on their last anniversary. In that moment, the sisters understood that they were no longer safe, not from the wolves outside, and not from the man they had once called father. Barnabas's grief had now twisted into something the daughters could no longer explain as mourning. When Sarah refused to wear her mother's dress, his rage erupted. He hurled dishes at the wall, his voice shaking with fury as he accused them of dishonoring Catherine. But beneath the anger was something even more chilling. He was no longer seeing Sarah as his child, but as a stand-in for his wife. Elizabeth, with her limited medical knowledge, recognized the signs of what doctors of the time might have called brain fever or nervous exhaustion conditions linked to trauma isolation and physical strain. Yet this diagnosis offered little comfort when faced with a man whose behavior had become dangerous and unpredictable. The sisters began sleeping in shifts, one always awake to watch their father. That vigilance soon revealed a darker truth. Barnabas had been slipping out into the snow at night, sometimes half-dressed to sit with Catherine's body in the smokehouse. When he returned from these visits, his behavior toward his daughters was even more unsettling. Sarah's entry on December 20th captures the horror. She followed him one night and overheard his conversations with the corpse's tender confessions of loneliness and longing. But then his words shifted, and he spoke of his daughters, saying they looked like Catherine moved like her, and that in the dim light, he could almost imagine they were her. By Christmas morning, the descent into madness was undeniable. Barnabas woke his daughters before dawn, insisting they dress in their mother's clothing for the holiday breakfast. He had set 5 places at the table, explaining with complete sincerity that Catherine would soon be joining them. The sisters, already pushed to their breaking point, began to show their own cracks. Elizabeth suffered constant headaches and dizzy spells. Sarah's drawings grew darker, filled with wolves whose eyes looked human and faceless shadows that seemed to hover at the edge of their world. The discovery Margaret made on December 28th marked a terrifying escalation. Hidden beneath Barnabas's mattress were letters he had written to Catherine filled with disturbing fantasies. In them, he confessed his attraction to the daughters, describing them in explicit detail and justifying his thoughts by claiming that God had sent them to comfort him and that Catherine's spirit had given him permission. Margaret's horror leapt from the page of her journal. She realized their father's moral compass had collapsed completely. Elizabeth searched their small library for guidance, finding only vague accounts of cases where grief and isolation shattered men's minds, leaving them unable to distinguish between right and wrong. But knowing this did little to ease the practical reality they were trapped in a snowbound wilderness with a father whose love had turned to something predatory. Sarah's entry from January 2nd, 1868, documents the moment the danger became physical. Barnabas cornered Elizabeth in the pantry and tried to kiss her, telling her she looked beautiful in her mother's apron. When she fought him off, he flew into a rage, accusing her of cruelty and declaring that Catherine would never have denied him affection. He insisted Elizabeth was failing in her duty as a woman to provide comfort to the man of the house. It was then the daughters realized that their father was no longer just grieving. He had crossed into a place where even they were not safe from him. Margaret's journal shows how the sisters, trapped in the mountains with dwindling supplies and a father whose mind had broken beyond recognition, struggled to invent ways to protect themselves without provoking his violent outbursts. At the same time, Sarah's careful notes on the wolf pack painted an equally grim picture. The animals were no longer content to prowl at night. They now appeared in broad daylight, circling the cabin bold and unafraid. Their howls had become layered and patterned, as if they were coordinating a siege, their presence pressing on the family's nerves like a tightening noose. Inside the cabin, hunger gnawed at them as food stores collapsed under Barnabas's sabotage. Elizabeth's calculations showed they had perhaps 6 weeks of rations left, under normal conditions, but normal no longer existed. Their father had begun hoarding provisions, hiding meat and flour in secret caches, convinced Catherine had warned him of thieves. He refused to eat anything prepared by his daughters, claiming only Catherine could be trusted to cook his meals. Margaret's entry from January 8th captures the grim debate should they risk a desperate journey to the Henderson homestead, despite the storms and the wolves. Elizabeth believed she might endure it. But Sarah's slight frame and Margaret's inexperience made the attempt nearly suicidal. Worse, Barnabas himself seemed determined to keep them from leaving. The sisters discovered missing snowshoes, hidden winter gear, and broken equipment sabotage designed to ensure they remained prisoners in his house. Elizabeth's notes are chilling in their clarity. She wrote that she believed her father understood at least dimly that his desires toward them were wrong. But instead of resisting, he sought to ensure escape was impossible. Sarah soon uncovered the most disturbing evidence yet hidden in the smokehouse were letters not to Catherine but to each of them individually. These writings read like proposals describing their bodies, their temperaments, and their potential as wives. He wrote with the same cold, methodical tone he once used for trade deals, sketching out plans for courtship and marriage, justifying it all, with the claim that Catherine herself had blessed the arrangement from beyond the grave. Sarah's journal captures the horror their father no longer saw them as his daughters. In his eyes, they had become replacements, women he believed God and Catherine had appointed to fill the void she left. Every letter was proof that his moral compass had not just wavered, but shattered. By mid-January, the sisters understood that survival meant more than outlasting the snow or keeping the wolves at bay. It meant enduring life inside the cabin with a man who had once been their protector, but was now a threat every bit as dangerous as the wilderness outside. The journals make it painfully clear the father they had known and loved no longer existed. In his place was someone unrecognizable, a man consumed by madness, isolation, and desires too terrifying to name. By late January 1868, the man the daughters once called father was gone, replaced by a stranger whose mind and morals had collapsed entirely. The blizzard that began on January 18th sealed their fate. Trapped in the cabin with no hope of escape, the sisters could only watch as Barnabas's delusions hardened into a terrifying new reality. Margaret's journal for that day captured it in one chilling line. The storm has made escape impossible, and Father announced at breakfast that God has answered his prayers by ensuring that his new wives cannot leave him. Elizabeth's medical notes reveal the pace of his deterioration. Sleep had abandoned him. He spent nights muttering to Catherine's empty chair, holding long, fevered conversations before turning his obsession toward his daughters. His appearance reflected the decay inside wild hair, hollow eyes, and a skeletal frame that made him look more beast than man. The horror escalated when Sarah discovered the marriage preparations. Barnabas had melted silver coins into crude rings and scrawled mock marriage certificates, each signed in Catherine's name, declaring his intent to wed his own daughters. Margaret's entry from January 22nd recorded the moment she realized how far he had slipped. He cornered her in the storage room, showed her the ring he had made for their wedding, and when she protested that fathers cannot marry daughters, he raged that she was no daughter at all. She was, in his words, a woman living in his house, eating his food, and therefore obligated to provide companionship. The look in his eyes was not paternal. It was hunger. Elizabeth later uncovered even more chilling evidence ledgers of courtship schedules carefully planned with the same precision he once applied to trade. Each daughter had her designated days for meals, conversations, and expressions of affection. Sarah documented the nightmare in sketches that have survived the cabin, twisted into a parody of romance. Catherine's possessions, arranged as decorations, and Barnabas's bedroom turned into a shrine, where her mother's memory and his fantasies of his daughters merged into something grotesque. Meanwhile, the wolf pack outside grew bolder. No longer content to circle, they tested the cabin in daylight, attacking in coordinated groups, probing for weaknesses. The daughters were besieged both within and without, and Barnabas found new ways to tighten his grip. With supplies running out, he began weaponizing food, withholding meals from any daughter who resisted him. Margaret wrote of his cruel justification: wives who do not show proper affection do not deserve to eat. The cabin became a prison of hunger and fear. The breaking point came on January 28th. Elizabeth awoke to find Barnabas naked at her bedside, clutching one of his homemade rings. He tried to force it onto her finger, mumbling prayers about fulfilling God's will. Her screams brought Sarah running, only to find their father in a state of arousal, his madness finally crossing the line from obsession to attempted violation. It was clear then the wolves outside were not the greatest danger. The true predator was inside the cabin. The daughters' journals show that by the time February arrived, hope had drained from the Wainwright cabin. Their father was no longer a grieving man. They saw him as a predator armed with sharpened knives and a soldier's cunning stalking them in their own home. Elizabeth's writing from those days makes their despair plain. We can no longer pretend father might recover his senses. He is gone. What remains sees us only as prey. Sarah captured it with terrifying clarity in her journal when Barnabas looked at them. Now there was no trace of protection or love, only the cold calculation of a man who believed his wife's death had released him from every moral boundary. In his mind, Catherine had not only permitted, but blessed his pursuit of their daughters. Worst of all, he seemed genuinely incapable of understanding their fear, treating resistance as something to crush, not as a warning to stop. The sisters fought back the only way they could, barricading doors with furniture, hiding crude weapons around the cabin, and keeping shifts through the night. But their father's training as a soldier, combined with his intimate knowledge of their habits and fears, made true defense nearly impossible. He was stronger, more cunning, and utterly convinced that God himself sanctioned his plans. On February 14th, 1868, that delusion reached its peak. Margaret's journal records his chilling declaration. Father announced that today was the perfect day for his wedding to Sarah with Elizabeth and me, to serve as witnesses to God's blessing. He had preserved Catherine's wedding dress, altering it to fit his youngest daughter's frame, and demanded Sarah wear it. When she refused, his rage erupted. He struck her across the face so hard, she collapsed against the stone hearth, blood running from a gash that would scar her for life. The refusal sparked the final confrontation. Barnabas tried to force Sarah into the dress, but Elizabeth, drawing on her last reserves of courage, struck him with a heavy iron skillet. The blow stunned him, just long enough for the daughters to seize their first real chance to fight. Margaret's account is vivid and harrowing. Their father rose again, no longer speaking words, but snarling like a wounded animal, lashing at them with knives, fireplace tools, and fists. He seemed immune to pain, his eyes burning with rage and a hunger that made him appear more beast than man. For nearly an hour, the cabin became a battlefield. Windows shattered, furniture splintered, and blood spattered across the walls. Elizabeth's wrist broke in the struggle, Margaret's shoulder was cut deep by her father's knife, and Sarah, though smallest, used her agility and sharp instincts to keep just ahead of his lunges. Her later sketches show the aftermath with disturbing accuracy. The home they had once filled with warmth and books now reduced to wreckage, Catherine's belongings scattered like silent witnesses to the family's destruction. In the chaos, Margaret recognized the one weakness still anchoring their father's fractured mind, his obsession with Catherine. If they could not overpower him by force, perhaps they could turn his madness back on itself. That realization marked the turning point in a fight that had become not just a struggle for survival, but for their very souls. Margaret's decision to invoke their mother's name proved to be the one tactic capable of piercing Barnabas's madness. While Elizabeth and Sarah continued fending off his assaults, Margaret shouted that Catherine was furious with him, that her spirit was disgusted by how he was treating their daughters. For a moment it worked. Sarah's journal describes the flicker she saw in her father's face. Confusion, shame, even horror, as if the man he once was had surfaced from the storm of his insanity. But then, it vanished. His expression hardened, and he hissed words that shattered any hope of redemption. Catherine is dead, and you killed her by being born. Now you'll replace her, or you'll join her. What followed was his final descent. Elizabeth's entry documents how Barnabas tried to methodically subdue each of them, beginning with Sarah, his youngest and most vulnerable target. She wrote of his movements with the cold detachment of a medic, a sign that trauma had forced her into clinical observation, simply to survive the unthinkable. Margaret's quick thinking bought them a reprieve. She seized an oil lamp and threatened to burn the cabin to the ground. Barnabas recoiled, but his military mind quickly calculated that his daughters would never destroy the only shelter keeping them alive through a Montana winter. The standoff hardened into a 6-hour stalemate. The sisters barricaded in the storage room, while their father paced outside, swinging between tearful pleading and furious threats. Inside, Elizabeth tended to wounds her own wrist, Margaret's deep gash, Sarah's head injury, while the three debated their impossible options: endure their father's assaults until spring, risk fleeing into the storm and the wolves, or do what once would have been unthinkable, stop him permanently. Sarah's journal reveals their grim conclusion. We realized the man outside our door was no longer our father. He was a predator, and if we allowed him to live, he would destroy us body and soul. The father we had loved was already dead. Margaret's final entry on Valentine's night distills the horror into one line. Tonight we learned that survival sometimes requires choices that destroy the survivors as completely as death would have. Decades later, in April 1943, Forest Service rangers stumbled upon the Wainwright cabin during a routine survey. Ranger Thomas Kovac's report describes the scene: a partially collapsed frontier home littered with overturned furniture, broken glass, and 4 skeletal bodies frozen in a tableau of violence and despair. 3 female corpses were found in the main room, alongside journals, drawings, and letters that gave investigators a chilling window into the family's unraveling. In the smokehouse, they discovered 2 more bodies, an adult male and a woman, who matched the description of Catherine Wainwright, still preserved in the frigid mountain air. Territorial coroner Dr. William Hartley examined the remains and confirmed what the journals had foreshadowed. The daughters had perished from starvation and exposure as the winter dragged into spring. Their bodies bearing defensive wounds, healed fractures, and the unmistakable toll of prolonged malnourishment and stress. The male body told another story. Barnabas Wainwright had not succumbed to the cold or hunger. He had been killed by a single precise stab wound to the heart, delivered with the anatomical knowledge of someone trained in medicine. Hartley's report left no doubt at least one of the daughters had made the final choice to end their father's life, ensuring that his madness could harm them no longer. The journals, sketches, and bones left behind transformed the Wainwright case into one of the darkest legends in Montana history. A tale of survival madness and the terrible choices isolation can force upon a family. The coroner's report made one fact certain. Barnabas Wainwright had not died by his own hand. The placement and angle of the wound to his heart showed he was facing his attacker conscious at the moment of impact and struck with precision. Elizabeth's final entry, dated February 15, 1868, confirmed what the evidence already suggested. Father is finally at peace, reunited with mother in the smokehouse, where he spent so many nights speaking to her spirit. We could not allow him to continue living with the madness that had consumed him, and we could not survive another day as prisoners in our own home. Margaret held him, while Sarah and I did what had to be done. Elizabeth's words describe a death that came not with rage, but with a strange kind of mercy. She wrote that Barnabas looked shocked, but also relieved, as though he recognized in that final instant the monster he had become. The sisters wrapped his body in Catherine's favorite quilt and laid him beside her in the smokehouse. But even with the immediate threat gone, survival was impossible. The food was gone, wolves prowled closer each day, and sickness spread among the sisters. Margaret was too weak to walk. Sarah was feverish, and Elizabeth herself confessed that her strength was nearly spent. We have agreed that we will not become like Father. We will not allow desperation to transform us into something monstrous, she wrote, signing only with her initial. The final pages of the journals are haunting in their clarity. All 3 sisters added shaky lines in those last weeks, acknowledging their decision to remain in the cabin rather than risk death on the trail. Margaret, ever precise, calculated every detail of their confinement. 127 days since isolation began. Temperature fluctuations, the wolves' estimated numbers. On March 8th, she wrote her last entry. Today marks 143 days since Mother's death. We have decided that 144 will be enough. Sarah's drawings, some of the last acts of her life, showed the wolves that had besieged them all winter. More than 30 animals sketched with unnerving accuracy, their movements recorded in ways that suggested intelligence and coordination well beyond normal pack behavior. Naturalists later found her illustrations invaluable for understanding wolf behavior in extreme winters. But for investigators, they were a chilling reminder of how the family had been trapped in a living nightmare. When the cabin was uncovered in 1943, investigators found not only the bodies, but more than 60 letters hidden in the debris, some to Catherine, some to the daughters, others to women never identified. These writings revealed the full collapse of Barnabas's mind fantasies of romance and marriage that blurred every boundary of morality. Dr. William Hartley, reviewing the evidence, concluded that Barnabas had suffered what modern psychiatry would call a complete psychotic break, driven by grief, starvation, and the isolating brutality of the frontier. He noted that similar breakdowns had been reported across the territories, though none so fully documented as this. Legally, the matter ended quickly. The territorial marshal's office reviewed the journals, drawings, and evidence of assault. The verdict was clear. Barnabas's death was justifiable homicide carried out in defense of life and virtue. No charges were filed. Officials then made a calculated choice. Out of respect for the victims and to avoid public panic, the site was erased from maps, the cabin dismantled, and the bodies interred in unmarked graves. All records were sealed officially to protect the family's reputation, though internal memos revealed deeper fears. Authorities worried that publishing the Wainwright journals could destabilize other frontier families living in isolation, planting the idea that such madness might come for them as well. Quietly, the case reshaped territorial policy. Winter protocols for remote settlements were updated with new guidelines for food storage, medical support, and patrol visits during the harshest months. But the truth of what happened in the Bitterroot Mountains in the winter of 1867-68 remained hidden away, buried in archives, and whispered only in legend and the story of a family destroyed, not by the wilderness alone, but by the collapse of the man who was supposed to protect them from it. After the Wainwright tragedy, territorial officials quietly rewrote the rules of frontier survival. New regulations required traders, trappers, and settlers living in isolation to maintain regular contact with authorities during the winter months. Emergency supply caches were hidden along major routes to serve as lifelines for families who might one day need to flee, not only starvation and storms, but dangers within their own homes. When investigators later spoke with local Native American tribes, they heard accounts that added an unsettling layer to the story. Elders described wolf behavior during the winter of 1867-68 that was unlike anything they had ever seen, packs forming larger than usual hunting, with strange coordination and approaching human settlements with no fear. They also reported eerie sounds carried on the wind across the Bitterroot Mountains, screams, voices, cries that tribal members interpreted as the restless spirits of a broken family. Investigators, knowing what the journals revealed, realized those voices were likely the desperate cries of the Wainwright daughters, echoing through the snowbound wilderness. The journals themselves became a focus for doctors, psychologists, and officials who recognized their unique value as a record of madness and survival under isolation. But they were never shared with the public. The explicit accounts of Barnabas's delusions, incestuous fantasies, and violence were deemed too disturbing to release. Modern handwriting analysis has since uncovered details that deepen the horror. Some of the later letters attributed to Barnabas were actually written in Elizabeth's hand, suggesting she was forced to transcribe her father's twisted dictations, turning his abuse into another form of psychological torture. Weather records confirmed that the winter of 1867-68 was the harshest in Montana history. Temperatures plunging to 40 below zero snowfall, exceeding 12 feet, and storms that erased any chance of escape. The Wainwrights were trapped in a natural prison surrounded by wilderness that offered no mercy. Sarah's sketches of the wolves, once seen as exaggerated, now align with modern biological studies. The pack size she depicted, more than 30 wolves, was extraordinary evidence of predators abandoning normal territorial behavior and banding together under environmental stress. Biologists note that such cooperative hunting would have made venturing outside the cabin tantamount to suicide. The Wainwright case has since been referenced in studies of domestic violence, psychological collapse, and the effects of extreme isolation on human behavior. Yet the full story remains sealed away in classified files, accessible only to a handful of researchers. Attempts to rediscover the cabin site have failed. Forest Service records suggest its location was deliberately erased from maps, and nature has since reclaimed what remained. What survives are the journals, the scattered reports, and the whispers of a family consumed by grief, madness, and the merciless wilderness that surrounded them. Local guides still whisper about the Wainwrights whenever they lead groups through the Bitterroot Mountains. Hikers occasionally stumble on rusted metal shards or fragments of bone, though no official confirmation has ever tied these finds to the infamous cabin. The wolves too left their mark. After the brutal winter of 1867 to 68, their numbers in the region dropped sharply. Tribal accounts say the enormous pack that haunted the Wainwrights' cabin scattered or perished in the storms. And yet, modern wolf studies have uncovered something peculiar in areas thought to be near the cabin's hidden location. Reintroduced wolves avoid making dens, steering clear of spots that otherwise seem perfect for hunting and survival. It's as if, even now, the land remembers. The Wainwright tragedy is more than just a tale of one family's downfall. It shows how fragile the human mind can become when pressed by grief, isolation, and the relentless cruelty of nature. Out on the frontier, survival wasn't just about hunting game or building shelter. It demanded a mental toughness that even the strongest sometimes lacked. Barnabas Wainwright lost that battle, and in the process, destroyed everything he had once built to protect. So what do you think? Was the full truth revealed in those journals, or do Montana's mountains still keep secrets buried beneath snow and pine roots? Could there be more to the wolves, the voices, and the silence left behind? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your theories. If this story chilled you, and you want more forgotten horrors from America's hidden past, don't forget to subscribe. Hit the bell so you never miss a tale, and share this with a friend who loves a good mystery. The frontier holds countless dark secrets. We'll be here to dig them up. See you in the next video.